Listen closely, and you can almost hear it. A British morning from years ago, when certain words floated through kitchens and hallways without a second thought. They were spoken over breakfast tables, called up the stairs, shared between neighbors at the gate. No one noticed them then because they belonged to everyone. Yet somewhere along the way, they quietly slipped out of use. When did that happen? When did familiar phrases fade into silence? All it takes is hearing one again, and suddenly you're back there. You won't believe how many of these words you haven't heard in decades before. When we look back to Britain in the years after the war, language felt closer, almost handheld. Words were shaped by streets, towns, and accents, not by screens or headlines. You learned how to speak by listening. To parents in the kitchen, teachers in classrooms, shopkeepers behind counters, workmates sharing stories at the end of the day. Certain phrases belonged to certain places, and everyone knew what they meant without explanation. Back then, language wasn't something you searched for or selected. It simply arrived, passed down like habits and manners. Children absorbed words from older generations, often without realizing they were learning anything at all. A phrase spoken by a grandparent could travel unchanged for decades, carried by memory alone. Today, words move faster than ever. They cross borders in seconds, shift meanings overnight, and arrive polished and prepackaged. But in mid-century Britain, language moved at walking pace. It grew locally, quietly, and collectively. And it's within that slower world that many familiar words first took root. Those everyday expressions didn't announce themselves as history, but they settled into lives so deeply that losing them later felt almost impossible to notice at first, until one suddenly returned and surprised us. The strange thing about forgotten words is how ordinary they once were. You might hear one spoken by a grandparent, gently correcting a child at the table, or drifting from the radio as morning chores began. Others echoed across playgrounds, shouted in good humor, instantly understood by everyone within earshot. On the high street, shopkeepers used familiar phrases that needed no explanation, because they belonged to that place and those people. These words were stitched into everyday scenes. A neighbor leaning over the garden fence, a parent calling time on outdoor play, a teacher restoring order with a single well-chosen phrase. No one paused to think about the language itself. It simply worked, like a shared code. What's surprising is how quietly many of these expressions slipped away. There was no announcement, no last day of use. They faded as routines changed, as voices disappeared from daily life, as new habits replaced old ones. Most people don't even realize these words are gone until they hear them again, perhaps in an old program, a letter, or a passing comment from someone older. Suddenly, the meaning comes rushing back, along with everything attached to it. The room, the people, the feeling of being there. A single word can do that. It can unlock a whole moment that's been waiting patiently in memory, ready to remind us how naturally these expressions once lived among us, before quietly stepping aside, long before modern habits reshaped speech into something faster, flatter, and less personal. What these words said about us was often more important than what they meant. They carried manners, expectations, and a gentle social glue that held everyday life together. A simple phrase could soften a request, slow a moment, or add a wink of humor to an awkward situation. Politeness wasn't formal, it was woven in. Patience was assumed. Thrift showed itself not through lectures, but through language that praised making do and looking after things. These expressions nudged behavior in quiet ways. Children learned tone as much as meaning, picking up when to speak, when to wait, when to offer help. Adults used familiar words to smooth the edges of busy days, to keep things friendly even when life felt tight. There was comfort in knowing everyone understood the same signals. You didn't need long explanations. One phrase could say, "We're in this together." Humor, too, had its own vocabulary. Light teasing, gentle understatement, a shared smile that needed no follow-up. The words made room for warmth without fuss. They reminded people not to take themselves too seriously and to carry on regardless. When those words faded, something else faded with them. Not overnight, and not everywhere, but slowly. Conversations grew quicker, more direct, sometimes sharper. The old rhythms softened, then slipped out of reach. Many of us didn't notice the loss at first. We just felt that something had changed, a certain ease, a familiar cadence. And now we realize how much they once shaped us all along quietly. It's curious how language can disappear almost imperceptibly. In post-war Britain, words traveled slowly, carried by conversation, repetition, and shared routines. By the 1970s and 1980s, life was speeding up. More people commuting, television filling homes with new speech, and workplaces adopting fresh, modern terms. Words that once threaded through morning greetings or market chatter began to feel old-fashioned, out of place. Children picked up new slang from peers or the radio, and the gentle, local phrases of their grandparents quietly receded. It wasn't a loss anyone intended. It was simply a shift in how people lived, worked, and connected. The humor, warmth, and shared understanding embedded in those words lingered, even as the sounds faded. Listening to them today, we sense the rhythm of a life that moved slower, where every phrase carried a sense of community. A reminder that language doesn't disappear suddenly, it drifts away with the everyday moments we no longer have. There's a special kind of comfort in hearing a word you haven't spoken, or even thought of for decades. It's like opening an old photograph. The edge is soft, colors a little faded, yet instantly recognizable. A simple greeting, a playful correction, a phrase of reassurance can transport us back to kitchens filled with the aroma of fresh bread, playgrounds echoing with laughter, and shops where everyone knew your name. These words carry more than meaning. They carry feeling, rhythm, and memory. Even if we no longer use them daily, they linger in the quiet corners of our minds, waiting to be recalled. And when we hear them again, there's a gentle, almost magical recognition, a sense of homecoming to a Britain that still exists in our hearts. They remind us that our language once moved slowly, warmly, and deliberately, shaping not just what we said, but how we felt. Today, our words travel at lightning speed, shared across screens, emails, and instant messages. Some phrases will linger, others will quietly fade, just as the familiar words of our childhood once did. Listening closely, we can imagine the stories future generations will uncover in our everyday speech. Every word we use is a small record of who we are and who we were. Perhaps it's time to pause, remember, and share the gentle language that shapes our lives.